Hi, boys and girls. I'm wearing my crown because it's King and Queen Day. So, I want to read you this story because by now you should have received your flat Mrs. Steiner. So funny, right? So, you're going to have some adventures with flat Mrs. Steiner, and I want you to post pictures or email them to me so that I can see all the fun stuff that we are doing together. And I thought it might be fun to read you Flat Stanley Goes Camping, so you can kind of get an idea of what it's all about. Here's Flat Stanley Goes Camping. It's created by Jeff Brown. Stanley Lamb Chop lived with his mother, his father, and his little brother, Arthur. Stanley was 4 feet tall and about a foot wide and half an inch thick. He had been flat ever since a bulletin board fell on him. There were lots of good things about being flat. Stanley could put on sunscreen in one wipe. Can you imagine? I know how much you guys hate putting on sunscreen. You could do it in one swipe. Stanley had the best back float at the pool. Stanley had the loudest belly flop too, but sometimes it was hard being the only flat kid in town. Is this guy being very nice? Doesn't look like it. I'm sick of being flat, said Stanley one morning. Flat is lame. Lame, said Mrs. Lamb Chop. Why, some of the best things in the world are flat. Like the newspaper, said Mrs. Lamb Chop. And fried eggs and pancakes and bacon, said Arthur. I guess so, said Stanley. Ooh, bacon. After breakfast, Mr. Lamb Chop started loading up the car with tents and sleeping bags. What's going on? Asked Arthur. We're going camping, said Mrs. Lamb Chop. This family needs some fresh air. All right, yelled Arthur. Stanley barely smiled. He's not sure yet, is he? After a short drive, the Lamb Chops arrived at the Roarin' River campground. Stanley was helpful as usual. He helped carry firewood. How did he help? They stacked it on his flat body. Stanley blocked the wind so his mother could start a fire. It's pretty helpful. But Stanley just wasn't himself. He wouldn't even eat any s'mores. Too flat, he muttered. Poor guy. Why don't you go exploring, suggested Mr. Lamb Chop. Good idea, said Mrs. Lamb Chop. Just don't get lost or fall off a cliff or touch any poison ivy. Have fun, dears. Sounds kind of dangerous, doesn't it? Stanley and Arthur set out. Hey, animal tracks, said Arthur. Let's follow them. The boys followed the tracks along the river, through some trees, and up a steep hill with a cliff on one side. The tracks end here, said Arthur. He peered over the cliff. I wonder what kind of animal made them. What do you think? What's your prediction? Arthur, said Stanley. Did you expect it to be that? Skunk, he whispered. Let's get out of here. But the boys were trapped. The skunk was on one side. The cliff was on the other. What's going to happen? The skunk raised its tail. What do we do? Arthur wailed. Mom said not to fall off a cliff, said Stanley. She didn't say not to jump off. Should they jump? Is that safe? Suddenly, Stanley grabbed Arthur by both hands and jumped. Ah! Screamed Arthur. Then Arthur opened his eyes. He wasn't falling, he was sailing. Above him, Stanley's body made the perfect parachute. The boys landed with a gentle plop. Pretty cool. That was awesome, said Arthur. Thanks, said Stanley. Now where are we? Arthur and Stanley looked around. All they saw were trees. We're lost, said Arthur, and it's getting dark. Then Stanley spotted something. There's a river, he said. Our campground is on the river. The boys ran to the water's edge. About a mile downstream were 2 cozy Lamb Chop tents. They gonna find their way back? What can we do? It will be dark before we can walk that far, said Arthur. I know, said Stanley. Stanley got a running start and belly flopped into the river. Splash! Then flipped over onto his back. Climb on! Woohoo! Cried Arthur. I always wanted to go rafting. Arthur and Stanley made it back to camp, drippy but safe. Let's keep this to ourselves, said Stanley. I can't believe we got lost and went off a cliff, Arthur said. At least we didn't touch poison ivy. There you are, said Mrs. Lambchop, just in time for supper. Another word for dinner if you haven't heard that before. That night, Arthur whispered to Stanley from his sleeping bag, You know, if you weren't flat, you couldn't have saved us today. Stanley smiled. Maybe being flat isn't so lame, he said. And the next day, Stanley found out another good thing about being flat. He could put on poison ivy cream in one swipe. Oh boy, they're covered. I hope you enjoyed Flat Stanley Goes Camping. If you like it, I will read you some more of his adventures. Don't forget, I want to see those pictures of you and me doing some activities. Bye guys, have a great day.